The world above was growing quiet. Somewhere far above the earth, the last light of an ancient sun was softening, dissolving into the copper and lavender haze that gathers at the edge of the world when the day finally relents and lets the darkness come. The stars, one by one, were appearing in the deep indigo of the sky, patient and unhurried, as they always have, as they always will. And beneath all of that, beneath the soil and the stone and the cold, still aquifers that no living eye has ever seen, there was another world, waiting, permanent and quietly vast. We are not going anywhere urgent tonight. There is nothing that needs to be done. The world above has already taken care of itself, and now, for a little while, we are simply going to sink, slowly and gently, into the oldest story humanity has ever told about what lies beneath everything. A story that was already ancient when the marble columns of Athens were still bright and new. A story of rivers that carry forgetting, of fields that stretch in every direction under a sky that has never known sunlight, of a kingdom so complete and so absolute that even the gods did not enter it lightly. Let the weight of the day settle through you now, down through your shoulders, your chest, your hands resting still at your sides. There is nowhere you are needed. The night is long and unhurried, and this story will carry you gently, the way a slow river carries a leaf, without effort, without destination, without any need to arrive. The Greeks called it Hades, a word that simply meant the unseen place. And that quiet, understated name tells you everything about how they understood it. Not a place of fire and drama, not in the beginning. Simply the place that cannot be seen, the place beneath the seen world, permanent and patient, receiving everything in its own time. In the earliest age of Greek understanding, before the philosophers arrived with their careful systems of reward and consequence, the underworld was imagined as something close to a vast grey twilight. Not terrible, not beautiful, simply endless and still and grey. When a person died, the Greeks believed that a part of them, the psyche, which we might loosely translate as the breath soul, the faint, warm shimmer of individual existence, detached from the body as naturally and quietly as breath misting on a cold winter morning and then dissolving into the air. It did not go up, it went down, or it went west, toward the far edge of the world where the river Oceanus circled everything like the outer band of some unimaginably large wheel. And so it travelled, this quiet wisp of a self, toward a geography that was already ancient before any living person had been born. A landscape whose rivers had been flowing since before the first word was spoken by the first human voice. The rivers of the underworld. This is where the story truly begins to breathe. and to slow and to settle. There were 5 of them, those subterranean rivers, and the ancient texts tell us that they eventually converged somewhere deep in the interior of the realm into a single great central marsh, a place of absolute stillness and perfect darkness, where the waters of hatred and woe and forgetfulness and lamentation and fire all became one indistinguishable whole. But before they merged, each river moved in its own way, with its own quality of silence and its own particular meaning. The first, the one that bound the entire realm, was the Styx. Its name meant hatred, though in the way the ancients used that word, it carried the weight not of sharp, burning anger, but of something colder and more final, the kind of deep, primordial refusal that lies beneath all things. The Styx circled the underworld 7 times, perhaps 9, depending on which ancient voice you listen to. And its waters coiled around the realm the way cold fog coils around the base of a mountain in the first hour before dawn. To swear by the Styx was the most binding oath an Olympian god could make, because the Styx was older than the gods themselves. An oceanid nymph, a daughter of the great encircling river, and her waters had a power that transcended even divine will. The hero Achilles was dipped in those waters as an infant, held by his heel, and the river's cold, dark current made him nearly indestructible, armoured by forgetfulness and hatred both, by the cold indifference of the realm below. The second river was the Acheron, whose name meant woe, and this was the river that most travellers encountered first. It was the great crossing, the water you had to pass to enter the realm at all. Mythology tells us that Acheron was once a son of the god Helios, the sun, transformed into a river as punishment for having given water to the Titans during their ancient war against the Olympians. And so a river that had once been lit by the warmth of the sun found itself flowing in permanent darkness beneath the earth, which is perhaps why its waters were described as carrying such a particular quality of sorrow. Not grief exactly, not the sharp grief of loss, but the older, softer grief of a thing that once knew brightness and no longer does. The third river was the Lethe, and in some ways it was the strangest of all of them, because unlike the others, it did not carry pain or lamentation or fire. The Lethe carried forgetfulness. Its name was the name of a goddess, the daughter of Eris, goddess of strife. And the Lethe flowed not through dark chasms of jagged rock, but, remarkably, through gentle, relaxing meadows, through soft fields of grass that moved like water themselves in some quiet subterranean wind. The river Lethe was peaceful, and that peacefulness had a purpose. The souls of the dead who were preparing to be reborn were brought to its banks and required to drink. And drinking, they forgot. They forgot who they had been, what they had loved, what they had feared, what they had built and lost and built again. The forgetting was not cruel. It was, in its own strange way, a mercy, an erasure that allowed the soul to begin again, unencumbered, unburdened, as clean as the first morning of the world. The fourth river was the Phlegethon, a stream of liquid fire and boiling mud that descended toward the deepest levels of the realm, flowing down and down toward the place called Tartarus, where the most ancient and the most transgressive of all beings were kept. The Phlegethon did not burn the way a bonfire burns, with crackling and the smell of smoke. This fire was heavier and slower, a deep molten glow that illuminated nothing but itself, moving in thick, viscous pulses through passages of black stone, its light reaching nowhere, warming nothing. One ancient text says that the goddess Styx herself loved the Phlegethon, and that Hades allowed their rivers to run parallel so that the two could be together, which is a strange and quiet kind of love story. Two rivers flowing side by side through the permanent dark, each the embodiment of something cold and something burning, keeping each other company in the silence. The fifth was the Cocytus, the river of lamentation fed by the tears of the dead. It flowed out from the Styx and into the Acheron, and along its banks gathered all the souls who had died without receiving proper burial. The unburied wanderers, those whose names had not been spoken over open graves, those for whom no coin had been placed over the eyes or beneath the tongue. The Cocytus held them at its edges, not in torment, but in a kind of perpetual suspension, waiting for the 100 years to pass that would, in some traditions, eventually allow them to cross. The sound of the Cocytus was not the roaring of rapids or the bright chatter of a mountain stream. It was lower and slower than that, the murmur of waters that carry salt, moving with the slow persistence of something that has been flowing for longer than memory itself. These 5 rivers, converging in the deep interior, created the hydrography of a world as real and as specific as any geography above the earth, and the ancient Greeks understood them not merely as physical features, but as emotional landscapes, as the actual substance of what it means to die. Grief given the form of water, forgetfulness given the form of a gentle current through soft meadows, suffering given the quality of liquid fire moving toward its lowest point. And now consider the passages into this world. Because the ancient Greeks were a people who needed to locate the sacred in actual soil, in real capes and lakes and volcanic craters, and so they found the entrances to the underworld scattered across the actual Mediterranean landscape, like half-open doors between the worlds. At the promontory of Taenarum, at the southern tip of the Greek mainland, where the land reaches down into the sea, and the stone is black and ancient. There was a cavern, and through it, so the stories said, the hero Heracles had descended, and the singer Orpheus had followed. The water of the Alcyonian lake at Lerna was said to be bottomless, a shimmering, unplumbable eye in the earth, through which the god Dionysus himself had travelled into the depths and returned. Near Naples, in the volcanic country where the earth still breathes with internal heat, the lake called Avernus lay still and sulphurous, and the fumes above its surface once killed the birds that tried to fly across it, which is how it earned its name, Avernus, the birdless lake. The Roman poet Virgil would place his hero Aeneas at the edge of that lake before he descended into the realm of the dead under the guidance of the Cumaean Sibyl, and perhaps those ancient travellers who passed that lake in their boats on the Bay of Naples could feel something emanating from its still surface, a weight in the air, a particular quality of silence. The boundary between above and below was not, then, some abstract metaphysical line. It was specific. It had addresses. It was the particular smell of sulphur at the edge of a volcanic lake, the cold that came up from a cavern in a cliff above the sea, the strange and bottomless quality of a lake in a marshy plain where the reeds grew tall and silent and nothing seemed to move. And yet, to actually cross, to actually enter the realm, required one more thing. One small transaction that the Greeks understood with a clarity that was almost businesslike in its simplicity. You needed a coin. One obol placed over the eyes or beneath the tongue of the dead, a single copper coin that served as the ferryman's fee, the price of passage across the Acheron, to the shore where the king of the dead held his quiet and absolute court. Without the coin, the shade would drift to the bank of the Cocytus and wait, carried by neither current nor destination, for 100 years or more, until the patience of the river finally relented. The coin was the smallest possible thing, a single obol, the lowest denomination of currency in the Greek world, barely enough to buy a handful of olives at a market stall, and yet it was the most important thing a living person could do for their dead. To place the coin was to complete the journey. To withhold it, even through neglect, was to leave someone suspended at the edge of a river in permanent grey twilight, uncertain, unlonged for, uncrossed. Somewhere beneath everything you know, those rivers are still flowing. The Lethe, moving peacefully through its meadows of pale grass, carrying forgetfulness in every current. The Acheron, dark and slow, carrying the woe of an ancient sun-child transformed into permanent shadow. The Styx, coiling its 7 or 9 loops around a world of absolute stillness, older than the oldest story, older even than the gods who swore their unbreakable oaths upon its surface. They have been flowing since before the first city was built, since before the first human voice gave a name to what it feared and what it hoped for in the darkness after death. And they are flowing still, somewhere below the reach of any light, patient and unhurried, as permanent as the earth itself, carrying everything home in the end. Let the weight of that knowledge settle through you now, gently and without urgency. The rivers are flowing. The world below has been waiting since before you were born, and it is in no hurry at all. It will receive everything, eventually, in its own time, with the quiet and absolute patience of water moving through stone in the dark. The night is long. There is no need to rush. Simply rest, and let the sound of those ancient waters carry you a little deeper into the dark, a little further from the noise of the world above, where the stars have been burning since before the first river found its name, deep beneath the earth, where the 5 rivers moved in their slow and separate purposes before finding one another in the central dark. There was a palace, not a ruin, not a dream of one, but a true palace, enormous and permanent, its halls never touched by sunlight, its corridors filled with a silence so complete that it had its own texture, like the texture of velvet in a dark room, something that could almost be felt rather than heard. This was the palace of Hades and Persephone, the sovereigns of the dead, and within it, seated upon thrones of gold, the king and queen of the unseen realm received every soul that had ever lived, and every soul that ever would. Let that image settle for a moment. The sheer scale of it. 2 figures upon golden thrones in the centre of a palace that had been receiving the dead since the first mortal drew their first breath, and then their last, since the first generation of human beings looked up at the sky and wondered, and then, inevitably, closed their eyes. The palace was not cold in the way we might imagine. The ancient texts describe it as surrounded by a court, populated, attended, its halls moving with the quiet business of a realm that never stops, that never rests, that receives an unending stream of arrivals without ever becoming full. Hades himself was not, despite what later centuries have made of the idea of a death god, a figure of cruelty or malice. The Greeks were careful about that distinction. He was stern, yes, absolutely and completely unmoved by pleading, entirely impervious to the particular human hope that some exception might be made, that some special circumstance might bend the rule. But he was not evil. He was simply the fact of death made into a person, the inescapable and impartial administrator of the one certainty that all living things share. He was the son of Cronus and Rhea, brother to Zeus, who held the sky, and Poseidon, who held the sea. And when the 3 brothers divided the world after their victory over the Titans, Hades drew the underworld by lot. He did not choose it. It came to him by chance, the way so many of the great defining circumstances of existence come to us, not by decision, but by the simple fall of the lot. because speaking his true name was considered something close to an invitation. The Greeks more often called him by his epithets, the careful, softened names that kept the reality of what he represented at a respectful distance. Clymenus, the renowned one. Eubuleus, the good counselor. Most commonly, Pluton, the wealthy one. Because all the riches buried in the earth, all the gold veins in the rock, all the silver seams threading through the stone, all the seeds of next year's harvest, sleeping in the dark soil. All of it was his. He was not merely the king of the dead. He was the king of everything beneath the surface of the world, which meant he was also, in his own patient way, the source of every living thing that would ever push upward through the soil toward the light. His queen was Persephone, and her story is one of the oldest and most dreamlike in all of Greek mythology. The story of how the above and the below came to be bound together, how the seasons came to exist, how the world learned to understand that the same force that pulls things down into darkness and stillness is also the force that drives them back upward into spring. She had been a young goddess of flowers, wandering in a meadow, when Hades came for her, in his golden chariot, drawn by 4 great horses, black and deathless, their hooves striking no sound on the dark road that opened to receive them. Her mother, Demeter, searched for her for 9 days and 9 nights without stopping, without eating, without sleeping, walking the whole surface of the world in grief. And the earth grew cold and bare in her absence, the crops failing, the trees letting go of their leaves like small surrenders. Persephone ate pomegranate seeds in the palace of Hades, a small number of them, 6 or perhaps 3, depending on which ancient voice you consult. And those seeds bound her to the realm below as surely as a wedding vow, as surely as a stone dropped into deep water. The pomegranate, with its dark chambers full of jewel-red seeds, was a fruit that the Greeks understood as belonging simultaneously to fertility and to death, to the sweetness of the living world, and to the unbreakable finality of having passed through the threshold of the below. And so Persephone became the queen of 2 worlds, spending part of each year in the palace of Hades, and the rest walking in sunlight with her mother. And the earth bloomed and went bare and bloomed again in rhythm with her comings and goings. A slow planetary breathing that has not stopped since the story began. Seated on their golden thrones, surrounded by the quiet machinery of an afterlife in constant, gentle operation, they received the newly arrived, the recently crossed, the freshly ferried. And between the living world and that throne room, there was a journey to be made. And that journey had its own attendants, its own particular figures, who have been standing at their posts since before the oldest human memory. Thanatos came first, or perhaps most quietly, the personification of peaceful death, moving through the world above with a gentleness that his brother, Hypnos, the god of sleep, shared completely. They were twins, those 2, and in the ancient texts they were sometimes described as nearly indistinguishable. Both of them light-footed, both of them bringing a kind of cessation that was not violent, but simply, finally, still. Thanatos would touch a person and the breath would leave them as quietly as a flame going out when the last of the oil is consumed, without drama, without resistance. The way a stone at the edge of a tide pool is slowly covered by the incoming water, and then simply gone from the surface of the world. And then there was the journey itself. The soul, newly separated from its body, needed to cross, and to cross, it needed Charon. He has been standing in his boat since the beginning, the ancient ferryman of the dead, his vessel low in the dark water, his pole moving with the slow, economical strokes of someone who has made the same crossing so many times that the motion has become completely automatic, a part of him, the way breathing is a part of the living. He was described as ancient beyond any other kind of ancient, his chin covered with the white and ragged beard of an old man, but old in the way that the oldest stones are old, not deteriorating, not frail, simply saturated with time, dense with it. His eyes burning with an unsettling intensity in the dark above the Acheron's slow current. He required his coin. 1 obol. The payment had to be made before the boarding, placed in the hand or dropped into the boat, and the soul that could not pay was turned back to the riverbank, left to wait on the shore of the Cocytus, to wander in the grey between space for 100 years, untransitioned, caught in the narrowest crack between one state of being and the next. This is why the Greeks placed the coin in the mouth of their dead, or over the eyes. This single small gesture of practical love, this understanding that even the journey into the absolute required one last transaction with the world of exchange and value. Those who paid were carried across without ceremony, without comfort, without conversation. Charon did not console the grieving dead. He did not explain where they were going. He simply ferried them, the boat moving through water that was dark and slow as cooling metal, and the far shore growing gradually clearer through the particular dimness that was not quite darkness, but was not any kind of light either. The permanent atmospheric condition of a world that had never known a sunrise. At the shore, at the great gates of the palace and the realm beyond, there was Cerberus. Cerberus in the Greek, the hound of Hades. And even the description of him from the earliest texts carries a quality of enormity that is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. The poet Hesiod, writing in an age when the myth was still forming itself, gave him 50 heads, which is an image so extreme it crosses back into something almost peaceful in its impossibility. The classical tradition settled on 3 heads, and that number has the right quality to it, 3 being the number that in so many mythologies signals something complete, something that covers all directions at once, something that cannot be outflanked. 3 heads, and a tail that was a serpent, and a mane that writhed with living snakes, and claws like the sharpened metal of a blade. But Cerberus did something unexpected with arriving souls. He wagged his tail for them. He fawned over them with his ears flat and his great body low, welcoming them in the way a dog welcomes someone it has been waiting for, with uncomplicated, overwhelming gladness. The cruelty of Cerberus was not in what he did to those who entered, but in what he did to those who tried to leave. Any shade that attempted to pass back through the gates toward the living world was met with something entirely different. With all three heads and all the fury of a creature whose single, absolute purpose was the one directionality of death. A handful of living mortals found ways past him. In the great hero tales, Heracles, who had descended into the underworld to capture Cerberus as his 12th and final labor, did it by strength alone, throwing his arms around the enormous neck and pressing until the creature submitted, allowing himself to be led back up into the light briefly before Heracles returned him, honoring the terms of his task. Orpheus did it with music, his lyre filling the passages of the underworld with a sound so beautiful that even the three-headed dog laid down all three of its great heads and closed its eyes and went still. The Sibyl who guided Aeneas did it with honey and drugged grain. A sop tossed through the dark air that Cerberus caught and swallowed, and then slept, and the two travellers walked past in the long moment of his unconsciousness. But these were extraordinary cases, exceptions so rare and so celebrated precisely because they were exceptions. For the ordinary dead, Cerberus was simply the final threshold, crossed once in one direction, without ceremony, into the vast interior of the realm. Beyond the gates, the great judgment waited, because the Greek underworld, at least in the classical period, when the philosophers and the poets had finished building it into its most complete and articulated form, was not a place of indiscriminate reception. It was a place of reckoning, careful, thorough, and presided over by three judges who had been chosen for their wisdom and their incorruptibility during their mortal lives. Aeacus, who had been the king of Aegina and was said to be the most pious mortal who had ever lived, serving as a guardian of the keys of the realm and the judge of those who came from Europe. Rhadamanthus, a Cretan lawmaker of such renowned honesty that his name became synonymous in the ancient world with the idea of fair judgment, presiding over the souls of those from Asia and serving as the Lord of Elysium itself. And Minos, the great mythical king of Crete, sitting with his golden urn, casting the final vote in cases of indecision, the ultimate arbiter, the last word. There was also, in certain traditions, a fourth judge, Triptolemus, the prince who had welcomed the grieving goddess Demeter into his city and learned from her the secrets of agriculture and the deeper mysteries. He presided over a special court for those who had been initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, the secret rites that promised their participants a passage through the afterlife that bypassed the ordinary sorting of the grey asphodel fields. The existence of a separate judge for the initiated speaks quietly to something important about the Greek understanding of the sacred, which was that the relationship between a mortal and the divine could be specifically cultivated, that there were paths through the great bureaucracy of the dead that were available only to those who had made certain commitments, undergone certain passages, drunk from certain cups in the darkness of a particular hall in Eleusis, by the light of torches whose smoke still seemed to carry some quality of revelation long after the fire had gone out. The judges weighed everything. They required the soul to speak its whole life, to confess what it had done and what it had failed to do, and they listened without hurry and without impatience, and directed each shade to the appropriate region of the realm that its earthly conduct had prepared for it. This was not a loud or dramatic process. The ancient texts describe it as something more like a proceeding, measured and complete, the kind of accounting that feels inevitable rather than threatening, precisely because it is so thorough, so patient, so comprehensive. Nothing was missed, nothing was overlooked. The whole shape of a life laid out in the still air of the judgment hall, received with the same impartial attention whether that life had been great or small, celebrated or forgotten. Above the surface of the earth, while all of this was unfolding in the realm below, the living were engaged in their own set of rituals, the careful, prescribed protocols through which the dead were prepared and sent off, and mourned, and then remembered across the seasons. There was the laying out first, the prothesis, which was managed primarily by the women of the household, who washed the body with water and olive oil, and dressed it, and wrapped it in white linen, and placed it on a high bier surrounded by flowers, the smell of those flowers mixing with the incense that was burned to manage what the Greeks called miasma, the spiritual contamination that death brought into a household, a contagious quality of disruption to the cosmic order that needed to be carefully managed and eventually purified. The coin was placed at this stage over the eyes or beneath the tongue, and the mourning began. The ritualized lamentation that was not simply the expression of private grief, but a public, community-wide performance of acknowledgement. The tearing of hair and the beating of chests conducted in a register that the whole neighborhood could hear, that made the death real and shared, and therefore, eventually, manageable. On the third day came the procession, the ekphora, before sunrise, the body carried through the streets in silence, because by law in many city-states, the procession could make no sound in the streets, a moving quiet through the early dawn, the dead being carried toward their place in the earth, while the city was still more night than day, while the light was still only a faint possibility at the edge of the sky. At the grave, the body was laid in or cremated, and libations were poured. Honey and milk and wine going into the earth to nourish the shade that was already, by then, beginning its crossing. Seeds were sometimes planted in the grave mound itself, the practical and the sacred folded together in the simple act of pressing a seed into turned earth, so that something would grow above the place where the body rested, so that the ground itself would be enlivened by the presence of what lay beneath it. Then the mourners returned home and ate together. A feast that was hosted, in a symbolic sense, by the one who had just died. A meal of gratitude and rebinding, the living community pooling back together around the empty space that death had made, finding their way back to one another across the table. And the rituals continued across the days and months and years that followed. On the third day after burial, and again on the 9th, the family returned to the grave. At certain festivals throughout the year, they returned again, bringing food and flowers and the spoken names of the dead. Because, in the Greek understanding of the world below, the dead were nourished by memory as much as by libations, sustained by the act of being remembered, of being named aloud by someone who had known them, which is one of the more quietly beautiful ideas in all of this ancient cosmology, the sense that what keeps the dead present and warm in the grey fields of the asphodel is not any quality of the place itself, but the warmth of being held in the minds of those who survived them. There were, each year, days when the boundary between the above and the below became permeable, when the dead were understood to be walking in the streets alongside the living, when the temples were shuttered and the shops were closed, and every doorway was smeared with sticky pitch to keep the wandering spirits from entering. And the people chewed hawthorn leaves as a ward against what the darkness might send up. These were the Anthesteria days, the festival of Dionysus and the dead together, the ancient understanding that the god of wine and the god of spring and the god of a certain kind of divine madness was also, somehow, the god who presided over the moment when the boundary between life and death grew thin as smoke. On the final day of the Anthesteria, pots of cooked pos and seeds were prepared and offered to Hermes, in his role as the guide of souls, the one who escorted the newly dead from the surface down to the crossing. And no living person was permitted to taste the offering. It was entirely for the dead, entirely for the shades of those who had been there since the great flood of Deucalion and all the generations since. And when the offerings were complete, the spirits were spoken back into the deep with a formula that was simple and direct in the way that the most ancient of all rites tend to be, stripped of elaboration by centuries of use, worn smooth out of doors. It is no longer Anthesteria. Go back. And the boundary closed again, and the temples reopened, and the sticky pitch on the doorways dried in the morning air, and the world above and the world below each resumed their separate purposes, each folded back into its own deep silence, connected by rivers and coins and rituals, and the sound of names spoken over graves in the early light. The darkness beneath the earth has always been patient. It has been waiting since before the first river found its course, since before the first grain of ash from the first volcanic eruption settled into the first cold sea. It waits still, quiet and permanent and vast, a palace with golden thrones at its centre, and 5 rivers finding their way home to each other in the dark. Let that image carry you now, not toward anything, not away from anything, simply forward and downward into the deep, unhurried dark, where the Lethe moves through its soft meadows, and the only sound is the faint, mineral murmur of water moving through stone. There were those who went down while still breathing. In all the vast catalogue of things that the ancient Greeks considered proof of extraordinary human greatness, perhaps none was more absolute, more final in its demonstration of a hero's reach beyond ordinary mortal limits than the act of descending into the underworld and returning. Not dying and returning, which was a different kind of story, the story of gods and their seasonal patterns, but actually walking down, alive and warm-blooded, through one of those half-open doors in the earth, through the volcanic lake, or the seaside cavern, or the cleft in the Sicilian hillside, and moving through the realm of the dead with a living heartbeat, a warm breath, a body that still carried the light of the world above it, like a faint illumination on the skin. The Greeks had a word for this journey, katabasis. It meant simply descent, the going down, and the word carried within it the understanding that what went down might, under extraordinary circumstances, come back up again. That the anabasis, the return, was possible if the person making the descent was exceptional enough, was guided well enough, was accompanied by the right kind of power or wisdom or heartbreaking, absolute love. Of all the katabasis stories that the ancient world produced, the one that has travelled furthest through time, that has been retold in more languages and more centuries and more art forms than perhaps any other Greek myth, is the story of Orpheus, who went down into the underworld for love, and almost brought his wife back out with him. Orpheus was a musician, the son of the muse Calliope and the god Apollo, or, in some traditions, the Thracian king Aegeus. And his gift for music was not simply a talent or an art. It was a force. When he played his lyre, a gift from his father Apollo, the sound he produced was not merely beautiful in the way that beautiful music is beautiful. It was something beyond that, something that reached into the nervous system of the listening world and stilled it, that caused rivers to pause in their courses and stones to lean toward the sound like flowers toward light, that made the wild animals of the forest lay down beside one another without aggression or fear and simply rest and listen. He had a wife named Eurydice, and the story of how he lost her is told quickly in all the ancient texts, as if the speed of the telling is itself a way of honouring the speed of the loss, the way the worst losses always arrive faster than the mind can fully register them. She was walking in a meadow on the day of their wedding or shortly after, and she stepped on a serpent hidden in the grass, and the serpent bit her heel, and the venom moved through her with a swiftness that allowed no intervention, no medicine, no chance. And before the afternoon was over, she was gone, her breath so descending through the earth toward the crossing, toward the Acheron, toward the far shore and the great sorting beyond it. Orpheus, alone with his lyre, did something that no other mortal had thought to do, or perhaps had thought to do, but lacked the music to accomplish. He went after her, not in grief's paralysis, not in resignation, not in the ordinary human acceptance that the dead are simply gone and the living must eventually return to living. He went after her, carrying his lyre, finding one of those doors in the earth and walking through it, descending. The descent of Orpheus through the underworld is one of the great slow scenes in all of ancient mythology, and the ancient poets describe it in a way that almost requires you to close your eyes to fully receive it. He played as he walked, the music moving ahead of him through the dark passages like a lantern that worked on sound rather than light, and the realm responded. Cerberus, at the gate, lay down all three of his great heads and went still, the snakes of his mane settling into quiet loops against the stone floor, his eyes closing one by one in the slow surrender of a creature overtaken by something more powerful than its own nature. The Furies, those ancient goddesses of retribution, who stood like burning pillars of accountability in the halls of the dead, paused in their work, and for the first time in the memory of the underworld, tears moved down their faces, because even the embodiments of righteous vengeance are not immune to the particular kind of grief that true music can carry. The tormented souls of Tartarus paused in their punishments. Tantalus, standing in his pool of receding water with the fruit branches always just beyond his reach, went still and simply listened. Sisyphus sat down on his boulder on the hillside of the abyss, the great stone still for the first time in its eternal rolling, and listened. The wheel of Ixion, burning and spinning in its perpetual retribution, slowed and then stopped. This is what the ancient texts describe: the music of a single living man moving through the realm of the dead, and for the duration of his playing, unmaking the suffering of the place, not permanently, not as a cure, but as a temporary suspension, the way a heavy snow can muffle an entire city into silence and make it briefly new again. He reached the throne room. He stood before Hades and Persephone, alive, his lyre in his hands, and he played for them, and he sang. He sang of love, and specifically of the particular love that he had for Eurydice, the love that had sent him down through the passage in the earth and past the sleeping hound and through the halls of the weeping Furies. And the ancient texts say that as he played, something happened in the throne room of the dead that had never happened before and would never happen again. Persephone wept. Hades himself, the inescapable, the pitiless, the utterly unmoved by sacrifice or prayer, was moved. The music found something in him that was perhaps not sentimentality, perhaps not sympathy in any ordinary human sense, but something older and deeper than either of those things. A recognition, a resonance with the absolute quality of the love that was producing the music. Hades granted the request. Eurydice would be returned to the living world. She would walk behind Orpheus as he ascended, following the warmth of the living man ahead of her through the passage, and she would emerge into sunlight and be restored. There was one condition, and the condition was simple and absolute, and, as it turned out, impossible. Orpheus was not to turn and look back at her until they had both fully emerged from the passage into the world of the living. He was not to look back. He walked. The passage was long and dark, and he could not hear her footsteps behind him, because the dead make no sound in the passages of the underworld, their feet falling on stone without weight, without any percussion of presence. He could feel, or he believed he could feel, something following him. Some warmth or some slight atmospheric shift that might have been her proximity. But he could not be certain. And with every step, the uncertainty grew, and the passage went on and on in the dark. And the silence behind him was complete and gave him nothing to hold on to. No reassurance, no confirmation that she was there, that the gift was real, that Hades had truly released her and not simply allowed the musician to believe he had as a kind of exquisite cruelty. He was nearly at the surface. The light ahead of him was beginning to change, the darkness thinning from absolute to merely deep, from impenetrable to simply shadowed. And somewhere in the texture of that thinning dark, he could sense the upper world, the cool outdoor air, the possibility of sunlight not many steps away. He turned. She was there. She was just behind him, her face turning toward his in the instant of his turning, and in that moment, her expression was described by later poets in ways that vary slightly but all carry the same quality. Not accusation, not despair, not anger at his failure, but something quieter and more permanent than any of those things. An acceptance. A farewell so immediate and complete that it left no room for anything else. And then she was receding, drawn back into the dark, her hand reaching perhaps, or perhaps not, perhaps only seeming to reach in the distorting light of the threshold. And then she was gone, back into the realm below, and this time there would be no second petition, no second hearing, no tears moving down the faces of the Furies for an encore. Why did he turn? The ancient texts do not say he doubted her. They do not say he doubted Hades. They say, in various ways, that he could not bear not knowing, which is one of the most human things that has ever been written down. The unbearable quality of walking towards something you love without being able to see it. The way the silence of the passage behind him grew louder with every step until the uncertainty became more real than the certainty of the gift he had been given. He had walked into death for love, and he had turned for love, for the same love. The desperate need to see the face of the person you cannot imagine being without, And the two gestures, the descent and the turning, were made of exactly the same substance, and only one of them was permitted. He came back out alone into a world that felt to him ever afterward like a place where the light was wrong, where the music he could still produce was real and extraordinary, but produced without the particular quality of joy that had given it its original power. And the ancient stories agree that in the years after his loss of Eurydice, he wandered the hills of Thrace playing, and the nymphs of the forest gathered to listen, and the wild animals laid down in the grass, and the rivers paused, and eventually he was torn apart by the Maenads, the ecstatic followers of Dionysus, for reasons that the various texts describe differently, and his head, still singing, still playing, floated down the river Hebrus to the sea. There is an island at the end of that story, the island of Lesbos, where the head of Orpheus came to rest and was buried, and where for many centuries afterward an oracle spoke. And people came from great distances to hear the voice of the musician answering from beneath the earth. He had gone down singing and come back up in silence. And even that silence was a kind of music, a testament to the absolute and permanent territory of the below. The descent of Heracles was nothing like the descent of Orpheus, where Orpheus carried music and grief. Heracles carried strength and the particular quality of implacable physical will that is the defining characteristic of the greatest of Greek heroes. He went down not for love, but as a labour, the 12th and final task set for him by the king Eurystheus, which was to bring Cerberus out of the underworld alive, without weapons, using only his hands. He found his entrance at the promontory of Taenarum, the black southern cape where the stone falls into the Aegean, and descended. And the dead who encountered him in the passages of the underworld parted before him, the way a current parts around a stone, because the living carry a quality of presence in the realm of the dead that is unmistakable, a warmth and a solidity that is both frightening and compelling to those who no longer possess it. He walked through the halls, past the shades of the heroic dead, and at the banks of the Acheron, he demanded passage from Charon in a way that Charon's entire eternal tenure had not prepared him for, with such force and directness that the ancient ferryman, for the first time, carried a passenger across without the coin. He found Cerberus at his post, enormous and three-headed and coiled with serpents, and he wrestled the creature with his bare hands, his lion's skin serving as armour against the serpent bites, pressing the great hound into submission through sheer pressure and persistence, until Cerberus yielded, not broken, but overpowered, and Heracles carried him up and out into the light of the world above, where Eurystheus, it is said, was so frightened by the sight of the creature that he hid in a large jar and refused to come out until Heracles agreed to take the hound back below, which he did, returning Cerberus to his post, completing the task, honouring the terms, and the underworld received its guardian back and closed its door behind the departing hero, and resumed its quiet operations as if the interruption had been simply one more variation in the long catalogue of extraordinary things that living mortals occasionally attempted. The third great descent, or rather the third great contact with the dead, was different in nature from both of the others, because it was not a catabasis at all, not a physical descent into the realm. The hero Odysseus, king of Ithaca, made his contact with the dead at the edges of the living world, at the far shore of the river Oceanus, where the fog never fully lifts and the sun sends its light only in a weakened, diffuse form that never quite becomes proper daylight. The Greeks had a different word for this kind of encounter, Nikeia, which meant something closer to a summoning, a necromantic ritual through which the living could call the dead up to the boundary between the worlds, rather than going down to meet them. Odysseus had received his instructions from the witch Circe, who sent him to the foggy margins of the world with careful, specific directions for what to do when he arrived. He dug a trench. He poured offerings into it, honey and milk and wine and water, and he sprinkled barley meal over the surface. And then he took the sheep he had brought with him and cut their throats over the trench, and let the blood run dark and thick into the earth. And the smell of it reached down through the boundary between the worlds, and the shades came up toward it, drawn by the scent of something they no longer possessed, the iron-rich warmth of living blood that for a moment, if they could drink from the trench, would restore them briefly to something closer to their former selves, would return their wits to them and their voices, and the particular quality of presence that the asphodel meadows had drained away. They came in crowds, so many of them that Odysseus, standing with his sword drawn at the edge of the trench to control who drank and in what order, felt a cold move through him that was not the cold of the foggy air. Young men and old men, brides and unmarried girls, warriors whose wounds were still visible, heroes whose names he recognized from the great stories, all of them pressing toward the blood with the focused, quiet urgency of thirst that has been going on for a long time and has been offered, suddenly, the possibility of relief. He spoke with the prophet Tiresias, who came and drank and told him the shape of what was still to come, the long way home and its particular difficulties, the condition on which the gods would allow him to arrive. He spoke with his mother, Anticlea, who had died during his long absence, and when he saw her there among the shades, his first instinct was to reach for her, to hold her, and she came toward him, and 3 times he tried to embrace her, and 3 times she slipped through his arms like mist, like a dream that dissolves when you reach for it. And she explained to him that this was the nature of the dead, that the sinews no longer hold the flesh to the bone, that the psyche is only what it is and not what it was. And the grief of that explanation was so precise and so complete that it reads even now across 3,000 years with a quality of personal recognition that suggests the poet who first shaped those lines had known this particular kind of loss himself. He spoke with Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, And Achilles asked after his son and his father, asked whether the old man still had his honour. And Odysseus answered what he could. And Achilles, who in life had chosen the short, brilliant existence of the glorious warrior over the long, quiet life of the man who tends his land and grows old in peace, turned and walked back into the dimness of the asphodel meadows with a long stride, exulting in what Odysseus had told him. The shade of the hero still carrying the posture and the movement of the man, even in the grey light of the world below. The dead do not lose their shapes down there, is what that scene tells us. They carry themselves forward into the grey fields with the same gait they had in life, the same tilt of the shoulders, the same particular way of moving that anyone who had loved them would have recognized from across a crowded room. What they lose is something more internal, more difficult to name. The warmth, perhaps, the capacity for forward motion. The sense that the next moment is open and available and might contain anything at all. But the shape of who they were, the specific, individual, irreplaceable, particular form of a self that persists, moving through the grey meadows among all the other particular forms, each one carrying forwards into the endless, still afternoon of the asphodel the unmistakable outline of a life that was once warm and moving and fully alive. Odysseus stood at the boundary of the worlds, with his sword in his hand and the blood-filled trench before him, and spoke with the dead, until the cold of the place had settled into him entirely, until the sheer number of the shades pressing toward the blood had grown too great to manage alone, until the sound of the underworld, which was not silence exactly, but a quality of profound, dense quiet, punctuated by the murmuring of the shades and the distant sound of the rivers finding their way deeper into the dark, had become the only sound in the world. And then he turned and walked back to his ship, and the fog closed behind him, and the dead went back to their fields, and the boundary sealed itself again as quietly and completely as water closing over a stone. He had not descended. He had stood at the edge and looked across, and what he had seen there was enough to carry with him for the rest of his long journey home, the knowledge of what the dead retain and what they lose, and the particular quality of the silence that waits on the far side of every crossing. The Catabasis stories all say the same thing in the end, each in their own language. The below is vast and permanent and older than any living thing, and it receives everything without exception, and it can be entered and even exited under extraordinary circumstances. But the ordinary rule, the deep gravity of the place, is always pulling toward permanence, toward the one-directional current of the Acheron, toward the eventual dissolving of the individual self into the grey fields where the asphodel flowers move in a wind that has been blowing since before the first human being looked up at the sky and gave the stars their names. The heroes knew this. They went down anyway, each one carrying their particular form of extraordinary, their music or their strength or their witchcraft-given rights, and they moved through the realm of the dead with the warmth of the living world still on them. And they came back out, most of them, bearing something changed, some quality of depth that had not been there before the descent, the knowledge of what lies beneath everything, carried back up into the light like water, cupped carefully in two hands, precious and slowly evaporating, already beginning to return to the place it came from. The passages are quiet now, and long, and the light at their ends is very far away, and very soft, and the only sound is the distant conversation of water with stone, somewhere deep below, the 5 rivers finding their way home to each other in the permanent and patient dark. In the deepest part of the deep, further below the surface of the underworld than the underworld itself is below the surface of the earth. There was a place that even the ancient texts approach with a kind of careful, measured distance, describing it from a great remove, as if even the act of narrating it too closely carried some risk of proximity. Tartarus. Hesiod, the oldest of the Greek poets to have left us his words intact, described it this way: as far beneath Hades as the heavens are above the earth. Which means that if you stood on the floor of the underworld and looked down, the distance to Tartarus would be equal to the distance from where you stand to the highest point of the sky above you. That great bowl of blue and black that arches over everything and contains the stars. The realm of the dead was the middle distance, and Tartarus was the absolute bottom, separated from the upper levels by iron gates and a threshold of bronze and walls of triple darkness that the ancient poets describe in ways that suggest they were reaching for a word beyond dark and could not quite find it. Originally, Tartarus was a prison for the primordial, for the enormous and ancient forces that had existed before the Olympian gods established their order. The Cyclopes had been held there, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones, those vast and strange early beings whose sheer physical complexity suggested a period of cosmic experimentation, as if the universe had not yet settled on its final forms. The defeated Titans had been imprisoned there after their war with Zeus, guarded by the dragon Campe, their enormous bodies stacked in the darkness like the ruins of a previous age. But over the centuries, as Greek theology developed its more refined interest in individual moral accountability, Tartarus evolved into something else as well, or perhaps something additional, a region where exceptional human transgressors, those who had not merely sinned, but had committed offences of such specific arrogance and such deliberate violation of the cosmic order that a general grey meadow of indifference was simply not an adequate response, served eternally tailored punishments, designed with a precision that was, in its own way, almost beautiful in its completeness. The punishments of Tartarus are not random. They are not arbitrary suffering applied to the wicked in bulk, as if the gods had simply gathered the worst of humanity into a room and applied misery uniformly. They are precise. Each one is a perfect mirror of the crime that generated it, a reflection so exact that the punishment and the transgression illuminate each other, each one making the other more clearly visible. the way a flame and its reflection in still water together create more light than either one alone. Tantalus stands in his pool. He was a king of Lydia, a demigod, the son of Zeus himself, and therefore the recipient of an extraordinary privilege. The gods invited him to dine with them on Mount Olympus, allowed him into the light of their company, shared with him the ambrosia and the nectar that sustained their immortality. He repaid this by inviting the gods to his table in return, and serving them, in a stew, the body of his own son Pelops, killed and cooked by his father's hand in what the ancient texts describe as an act of hubris, so comprehensive that it is difficult to even fully parse all of its dimensions. The violation of kin, the violation of hospitality, the desire to test whether the gods were truly omniscient, the reduction of the most intimate of all human bonds to the raw material of an experiment in arrogance. The gods recognized the abomination immediately. All of them except Demeter, who was still raw with grief over Persephone and ate a small piece of Pelops' shoulder before registering what she had done. And Zeus restored the boy, replacing the missing shoulder with a piece of carved ivory, and sent Tantalus to Tartarus, where he stands in cool, clear water up to his chin, beneath branches heavy with ripe fruit, figs and pears and apples and pomegranates, hanging close enough that he has only to tilt his head back to drink and reach up to eat. And the water recedes. Every time he bends toward it, the water pools back into the earth, leaving only damp stone beneath his feet. And he straightens, and the water rises again to his chin, and the fruit hangs close above him, and when he reaches upward, the wind moves the branches just beyond his grasp, always just beyond, the fruit swinging gently in the perpetual mild wind of that lowest region, close enough that he can smell it, close enough that the smell alone is a kind of cruelty. The abundance always present, always withheld. And he stands in the knowledge that he is surrounded by what he needs and cannot reach any of it. The English word tantalize comes from his name. When we say that something tantalizes us, we are invoking, without knowing it, this figure standing in his pool in the deepest level of the underworld, reaching for fruit that the wind perpetually moves away from his fingers. And the word has travelled 3,000 years from a dark pool beneath the earth to describe a quality of longing that every living person has felt. The desire for something close and visible and apparently attainable that remains, always, just beyond. Sisyphus rolls his stone. He was the king of Corinth, and he was cunning in a way that the Greek world generally admired. But he made the error of turning his cunning against the cosmic order itself, attempting to outwit death not as a metaphor, but as a literal project. He chained the god Thanatos, the personification of peaceful death, and while Thanatos was chained, no one in the world could die, which sounds, at first consideration, like it might be a gift. but was, in fact, a kind of horror, because the dying who could not die continued in their dying without resolution, suspended in a state of pain and dissolution that had no end and no transition. Ares, the god of war, was the one who eventually freed Thanatos, because a war in which no one could die was a war that had lost its essential quality, and the unchained death came for Sisyphus himself. But Sisyphus had prepared for this moment, had left instructions with his wife not to perform the proper burial rites for his body. And so, when he arrived at the crossing as a shade, he had grounds to petition Persephone for a temporary return to the living world, to punish his wife for her negligence. And Persephone, moved by the apparent grievance, allowed it. And Sisyphus went back up into the sunlight and simply lived for additional years, refusing to return, until Hermes was eventually sent to bring him back by force. For this, for the extraordinary audacity of having twice refused the one universal law, he was set to his particular labour in Tartarus, rolling a boulder of enormous weight up a steep hillside, the stone always reaching almost to the summit, and then, with the terrible, patient logic of the place, rolling back down to the bottom, and Sisyphus following it, and beginning again. The stone never reaches the top. This is not because Sisyphus lacks strength or because the hill is unconquerable. It is because the task itself is the punishment, and the completion of the task would end the punishment, which the design of the place does not permit. He rolls the stone because he tried to be cleverer than the order of the cosmos, and the order of the cosmos has given him a task that will last as long as the cosmos does, which is its own kind of response to his particular quality of ambition. Ixion spins on his wheel. He was a king who murdered his own father-in-law and was purified of the crime by Zeus himself, who took him up to Olympus and offered him divine hospitality. And Ixion repaid this hospitality by attempting to force himself on Hera, the queen of the gods, Zeus's wife. Zeus created a cloud in the shape of Hera, and Ixion pursued it, and the cloud phantom bore children who became the centaurs, those half-human, half-horse beings of the wild places. And Ixion was bound to a wheel of fire that spins continuously in Tartarus. And as it spins, it is said he calls out a phrase that has been turning with the wheel since the beginning of his punishment: gratitude to Zeus for his hospitality, as if the spinning itself is a perpetual, dizzy acknowledgement of the generosity he violated. Tityos lies stretched across 9 acres of the floor of Tartarus, a giant whose body in death covers as much ground as a small landscape. And 2 vultures attend to him perpetually, feeding on his liver, which the Greeks understood as the seat of passion and desire, the organ of wanting. And the liver grows back each night, so that the feeding can resume the following day, and the day after that. The desire that drove his crime perpetually renewed and perpetually consumed, a cycle as endless as the spinning of Ixion's wheel or the rolling of Sisyphus's stone. The Danaïdes 49 sisters carry water in vessels full of cracks, trying to fill a bath that has never been filled and will never be filled, the water leaking away as fast as they pour it in, and they carry their cracked jugs back to the source and fill them again, and carry them back and pour them in again, and the sound of the leaking water has been falling on the stone floor of Tartarus since the night they murdered their husbands at their father's command. And it will go on falling long after every other sound in the world above has changed. The genius of the Tartarian punishments, what makes them something more than simple cruelty applied to the transgressive dead, is precisely this quality of reflection. The gods did not create suffering as an end in itself. They created mirrors and placed the worst offenders inside them. Tantalus, who abused abundance, is given abundance he cannot access. Sisyphus, who tried to be smarter than death, is given a task that exercises his strength forever without resolution. Ixion, who violated hospitality while spinning in the orbit of divine favor, spins in an orbit of his own. The punishments are the crimes turned inside out and made eternal, and the living who heard these stories in the theatres and symposia of ancient Athens understood them not as threats, but as illustrations, vivid and exact demonstrations of what it looks like when the moral architecture of the universe makes its most complete and articulate statement about the relationship between what we do and what we become. All of this, the grey meadows and the rivers, and the golden throne room and the iron gates of Tartarus, was available to the dead, whether they understood it or sought it or not. It was the automatic geography of the afterlife, the default, the given. But there were those in the ancient world who believed that the default could be supplemented, that knowledge could ease the passage, that the right preparation could change the experience of what came after death so completely that the whole grey indifference of the asphodel meadows might be bypassed entirely. These were the initiates of the mystery cults, and their understanding of the underworld was both more personal and more navigable than the standard version, annotated with specific geography and armed with specific passwords. A traveller's guide to a territory that everyone would eventually visit, but almost no one had studied in advance. The greatest of the mystery cults was the Eleusinian Mysteries, rooted in the myth of Demeter and Persephone, held at Eleusis in the sacred complex outside Athens, and attended over the centuries by some of the most significant figures in the Greek world. The philosopher Plato was initiated, the playwright Sophocles, the statesman Pericles, the geographer Pausanias. Common people and aristocrats and artists and politicians all made the journey to Eleusis in the late summer, fasted, processed through the landscape carrying torches, paused at the Agalastos Petra, the mirthless stone, the rock rock at the edge of the Charon well, where the grieving Demeter had sat during her 9-day search for Persephone. Too deep in sorrow to eat or drink or speak, simply sitting on the stone in the way that grief sometimes reduces even divine beings to stillness. What happened in the Telesterion, the great hall of initiation, was never written down. The mysteries were, in the most absolute sense of the word, secret. And the penalty for revealing them was death. And the secret held, across centuries and generations of the initiated, which is itself one of the most remarkable facts about the ancient world, that so many people, for so long, kept the same secret with such completeness. What we know is that it involved a descent into darkness and an emergence into extraordinary, overwhelming light. That it was described by those who had experienced it as something that changed their relationship to death entirely. That after the ritual, the initiates no longer feared death in the same way, not because they had been told something reassuring, but because they had experienced something that made the fear unnecessary. Some revelation in the light of the Telesterion that the Homeric hymn to Demeter simply calls blessed, saying that those who had seen it would go to the realm below in happiness, while those who had not seen it would go in cold, dark grief. The Orphic cults went further and in a more portable direction, where the Eleusinian mysteries required presence, attendance. The actual journey to Eleusis and the actual experience of the ritual, the Orphics created something that the dead could carry with them, something that would function in the geography of the underworld the way a map functions for a traveler in an unfamiliar landscape. The gold tablets. They were small, remarkably small, thin sheets of gold leaf beaten to a thinness that made them almost translucent, folded carefully into compact rectangles that could be placed in the mouth, or on the lips, or inside the burial wrappings of the dead, and inscribed with text so fine that the letters were barely visible to the naked eye, the words pressed into soft gold by a stylus in the hand of someone who understood that these instructions would be needed in a place where there would be no one to ask for directions. The tablets were found in graves across the Greek world, in the Italian south and in mainland Greece and on Crete, separated by geography and time, but carrying variations of the same essential message, the same careful map of the underworld's crucial geography, the same passwords, the same sequence of instructions for a soul that had been properly prepared. The soul, newly arrived at the halls of the dead, would find 2 springs. The first would be on the left, marked by a white cypress tree whose luminous bark was visible even in the darkness of the realm. This was the spring of Lethe and the natural impulse of the newly dead. Dry from the journey, confused from the transition, would be to drink from it, and drinking from it would be the worst possible thing they could do, would dissolve the very preparation that the gold tablet was trying to preserve, would erase the memory of who they were and what they knew, and return them to the grey cycle of forgetting and rebirth, without any of the wisdom they had accumulated. The tablet instructed, "Do not drink from the spring on the left, not under any circumstances, not despite the thirst." The second spring was on the right, flowing from the lake of Mnemosyne, the lake of memory, and beside it stood guardians who would challenge any soul that approached, demanding to know its origin and its purpose. And for this challenge the tablet provided specific words to speak, a declaration of identity and of knowledge, the password of the prepared soul. "I am a child of earth and starry heaven. I am parched with thirst, and I perish. But give me to drink from the ever-flowing spring on the right, by the cypress." The guardians would stand back, the soul would drink, and the water of memory would restore what the journey had diminished, would return to the dead person the full, clear knowledge of who they were and where they had come from and what they had prepared for, and they would move through the halls of the dead, not as a bewildered shade stripped of its wits, but as an initiated soul carrying its knowledge like a lantern, able to navigate, able to address Persephone herself with the declaration of purity and preparation that the tablets also provided. The words spoken before the Queen of the Dead that identified the speaker as one of Bacchus's own, as a soul that had been liberated from the wheel of reincarnation, as a being returning at last to its divine origin. Happy and fortunate, the tablets promised, in their worn gold letters, "You will be a god from mortal that you were." The smallest object imaginable, a rectangle of gold so thin it could be folded 3 times and still fit inside a closed fist, carrying the complete instructions for what to do on the other side of dying. And then there was Plato, the philosopher who took all of this, the rivers and the judges and the fields of grey asphodel and the golden paradise of Elysium and the spinning torments of Tartarus, and placed it inside a larger machine, a cosmic system of such elegant and comprehensive design that it explained not just where the dead went, but why, and not just why, but to what eventual purpose, and not just to what purpose, but by what mechanism the entire universe was maintained in its beautiful, turning order. He called it the myth of and he placed it at the very end of his greatest work, the Republic, as if everything that had come before, all the political philosophy and the theory of the ideal state and the arguments about justice and education and the nature of the soul, had been leading to this final vision, this account of a soldier named who died in battle and returned to life on his funeral pyre 2 days later with a complete memory of what he had seen. Had watched souls arriving at a meadow that had 4 openings, 2 into the sky and 2 into the earth, and judges sitting between them, directing the righteous upward into 1,000 years of heavenly reward, and the wicked downward into 1,000 years of proportional suffering, 10 times over for every harm they had done during their mortal century. The mathematics of cosmic justice worked out with a precision that suggests Plato believed the universe kept very accurate accounts. He watched the souls return after their 1,000 years, travelling to a place that contained one of the most extraordinary images in all of ancient philosophy. The spindle of necessity, a vast cosmic machine of concentric whirls that represented the entire structure of the universe. The planetary orbits nested inside each other like rings within rings, each one carrying its sphere of sky and its siren singing a single continuous note. The 8 notes blending into a single harmony, the music of the spheres. That sound which the ancients believed the universe made as it turned, which human ears had grown too accustomed to silence to hear. The way a person who lives near a waterfall eventually ceases to notice the sound of the water. 3 fates sat at the base of the spindle, daughters of necessity herself, dressed in white, and they assisted in the turning, and one of them sang of the past, and one of the present, and one of the future. And all of this, the spinning of the planetary whirls, and the singing of the sirens, and the weaving of the fates, happened in absolute coordination. A machine of such complete and interlocking precision that the word for it was not mechanism, but music. The souls gathered before the spindle and were given lots, and were shown an enormous array of possible lives to choose for their reincarnation, animal lives and human lives, the lives of tyrants and the lives of beggars, the lives of athletes and scholars and farmers and wanderers, and through the mouth of a prophet who spoke on behalf of Lachesis, the fate of the present. Plato issued his most profound statement about the nature of human freedom. The genius will not be allotted to you, but you will choose your genius. The responsibility is with the chooser. God is justified, which means the universe does not assign you a life. You choose it, and the choosing is made from the accumulated wisdom, or folly, of all your previous lives, from everything you have learned, and everything you have failed to learn, from the clarity or the confusion with which you have navigated all the previous cycles of your existence. The soul that draws the first lot and immediately grabs the most powerful and wealthy-seeming life without examining it carefully will discover, too late, that it is the life of a tyrant who will devour his own children. The soul of Odysseus, weary of adventure and suffering and cleverness and the exhausting demands of being exceptional, searches quietly through the available lives until it finds the life of a private citizen, a quiet life, a life of unremarkable peace, and chooses it with relief, with something that the text describes as almost contentment, saying that he would have chosen it even first. After the choosing, the souls were led across the scorching plain of oblivion to the river Lethe, and each one drank according to its wisdom, the foolish drinking deeply and losing everything, the wise drinking sparingly and retaining faint echoes of where they had been and what they had seen. Shadows of memory that might, in the next life, manifest as intuition, as the inexplicable sense of recognition in the presence of certain ideas, as the philosopher's feeling that knowledge is not learned, but remembered, recovered from beneath the surface of a forgetting that was never quite complete. And then sleep on the banks of the river, and at midnight an earthquake, and the souls shot upward in all directions like stars flung from the hand of the universe, each one descending into the body that was waiting for it, the new life beginning. The previous cycle closed, the spindle turning, the sirens singing their 8 notes into the great harmony that was always there, and could almost, if the conditions were right and the silence complete enough, be heard by those whose inner ear had been sufficiently prepared. Plato ends the myth of not with grand philosophical summary, but with something quieter, something almost pastoral. If we are persuaded by his account, he says, we will believe that the soul is immortal and capable of enduring every kind of good and ill, and we will hold fast to the upward road and pursue justice with wisdom, so that we may be at peace with ourselves and with the gods, both while we remain here and when we receive our reward. And be happy. Happy, the same word that the gold tablets promised their initiates. The same quality of ease and rightness that the Eleusinian initiates were said to carry with them after the light of the Telesterion had entered them. The same condition that the white island of Elysium offered its heroes. Rosy meadows and the west wind blowing from Oceanus, and the company of all the great ones who had ever lived. The Greek Underworld, in the end, was not a place of endings, but of continuations, vast and patient and receiving. The permanent deep structure beneath the temporary brightnesses of individual lives. The river that all other rivers eventually find their way into. The dark that does not extinguish the light, but simply receives it when the light is ready to rest. And now the story has come to its deepest place, and the rivers are very far below, and the night above is complete and still, and the palace at the center of the realm is quiet on its thrones, and the spindle turns in its slow and perfect music somewhere at the edge of the cosmos, and the asphodel meadows are empty of urgency, full of the particular piece of things that have finished their turning and settled at last into the profound restfulness of the permanent. The torches in the halls of the underworld have burned very low. The shades in the grey meadows have gone still, the pale flowers around their feet not moving, the subterranean wind completely quiet. In the deepest levels, even the rivers have softened their sound, the Acheron barely whispering over its stones, the Lethe moving through its meadows without the sound of water at all, only the faintest suggestion of current, of slow and gentle motion carrying everything gently toward the center. The palace is still. The thrones are empty in the particular way that thrones are empty when the night is very late and the business of the realm has paused. The gold catches no light and gives none back. The corridors are long and quiet. The gates are closed. The hound is sleeping, all three heads lowered to the stone, the serpents of his mane looped softly in the dark, his breathing slow and even. The deep chest rising and falling with the unhurried rhythm of a creature that has been at its post since before memory, and will be there until after it. Somewhere above the earth, the stars are still turning. The spindle of necessity is still spinning its planetary whirls. The sirens still singing their 8 continuous notes into the great harmony. But the sound is very far away now, softened by distance and darkness into something barely distinguishable from silence itself. The fields are still. The rivers are still. The night is complete. There is nothing to do. There is nowhere to go. There is only the dark and the ancient peace of the permanent things, and the slow turning of the universe in its enormous quiet. Rest now. Everything that was will be received. Everything that is will be held. The rivers flow. The fields are still. The dark is soft and complete. And somewhere in the deep, in the meadows of the Lethe, beside the ever-flowing spring, the water moves, and the night holds everything, and the night holds everything, and there is only rest.